My name is Marisol Delgado. I am 31 years old and I used to believe that family meant the people who showed up for you no matter what. I believed that for a long time, longer than I should have maybe. I was wrong. Not wrong the way you are when you misread a map. Wrong the way you are when you have been following directions written by someone who never wanted you to arrive. I should start at the beginning. Not my beginning, that story is ordinary enough. A small house in Fresno, California, 2 parents who worked hard, a father who worked harder and made sure everyone knew it, and a younger sister named Priya who had my mother's smile and my father's confidence and seemed, from the first day I could form the memory, to belong in that house in a way I never quite did. My name, to be clear, is Marisol. My father named me after his grandmother, a woman he described in the past tense even though she was still alive when I was born. I did not find that out until I was 22. I tell you this because it is the kind of detail that only makes sense later, a name pulled from someone who had already been buried in the story my father told about himself, given to a daughter he had already begun, in some quiet way, to put in the same category. I am an occupational therapist. I have been for 7 years. I work with children and adults recovering from neurological injuries, strokes, traumatic brain injuries, developmental delays. I help people relearn how to hold a fork, how to button a shirt, how to move through a world that stopped cooperating with them. I am good at this. I say that plainly, not out of pride, but because it matters to what comes later. I am patient. I know how to read a room, how to watch someone without making them feel watched, how to understand what is not being said by what the body does instead. I did not grow up knowing this was what I would do. I grew up knowing I was going to have to build something on my own, because the path my parents imagined for the family had a very specific center of gravity, and I was not it. My sister Priya is 5 years younger than me. She is warm and bright and for most of our childhood my closest friend. She also made choices, beginning when she was about 20, that none of us could have predicted. A relationship that moved too fast, a pregnancy at 22, another at 24, and a partner who was present and then, in the way some people are present and then aren't, entirely gone. Priya is not the villain of this story. I want to be clear about that. Priya was doing the best she could with a situation that had collapsed around her in ways she hadn't anticipated, and when she couldn't manage anymore, she called me. I was 28. I had a 1-bedroom apartment in Sacramento, a full caseload at a pediatric rehab clinic, and exactly 0 experience with children outside of a clinical setting. Her boys were 6 and 3. I said yes. If you are watching this and you have ever taken someone in, a child, a parent, a sibling's kid, you know there is a moment right after you say yes when the reality of what you have agreed to lands all at once, like weather. I want to ask you, did anyone thank you for it? Or did they just hand you the bag and walk out the door? I moved the boys into my apartment on a Thursday. Tomas was 6. Nando was 3. Tomas had his mother's dark eyes and a stillness that I recognized immediately as the stillness of a child who had learned to read the temperature of a room before deciding whether to be in it. Nando was round-faced and loud and delighted by everything, by the pigeons outside my window, by the sound the refrigerator made, by the way I pronounced his name with the stress on the first syllable instead of the second. He corrected me every single time. I let him. Within a month it was no longer temporary in any practical sense. Priya was in a residential program in Bakersfield. She called when she could. She sent drawings she had made in her art therapy sessions, careful little watercolors of flowers and birds, and Nando taped them to the wall beside his bed and kissed them goodnight. Tomas looked at them and said nothing, and I did not press him. I enrolled Tomas in 2nd grade at the school 4 blocks from my apartment. I found a daycare for Nando that had a sliding scale I could almost afford. I restructured my work schedule, pushed my first appointments to 8 so I could do drop-off, arranged for a neighbor's college-age daughter to manage pickup on the days I had late sessions. I tracked every expense in a notebook because I did not yet trust myself to track them in my head. Tomas needed new shoes by October. Nando outgrew 2 sets of pajamas before Thanksgiving. My parents lived 40 minutes south, in the same house in Fresno where Priya and I had grown up. They had, when I told them what was happening, expressed concern about Priya, about the boys, about the situation broadly, and they had also made clear, in the particular way my father had of making things clear without stating them directly, that they were not in a position to take the boys themselves. My father had his business. My mother had her routines. There were reasons. I did not argue with the reasons. I moved the boys in and I did not argue. Act 2. The first Sunday of November, about 6 weeks after the boys had been living with me, I drove them down to Fresno for what my mother had described on the phone as a proper family dinner. I remember thinking on the drive down that this was a good sign. That my parents were finding their footing with the situation, the way people do when something unexpected becomes real. The house smelled the way it always had, garlic and something sweet, a candle my mother had burned in the kitchen for as long as I could remember. Nando walked in and immediately pressed his face against the side of my leg and then, just as quickly, detached and walked toward the kitchen because he had spotted a bowl of grapes on the counter, and that was enough information for him to feel at home anywhere. Tomas stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in. He was 6 years old and he stood in that doorway and looked at the room the way I used to look at rooms, measuring. I put my hand on his shoulder and he came in. My mother took Nando up into her arms immediately. She called him her little one in Spanish, kissed both of his cheeks, said he had grown an inch since she last saw him. He had not seen her since he was a baby and she spoke to him as though they were resuming something. My father looked at Tomas from across the room and said, "He's got his father's face." It was not a compliment. I knew it was not a compliment because of the pause that came before it and the way my father turned back to the football game on the television afterward. Conversation closed. Tomas looked at the floor. I felt something tighten in my chest, small and fast, and I set my bag down on the bench by the door and said, "Tomas, do you want to see if Nando needs help with those grapes?" And Tomas nodded and went. Dinner was the way dinners in that house had always been. Food on the table, conversation circling around my father, my mother moving between the kitchen and the table in a rhythm that had been established so long ago it no longer required thought. Nando performed for the room. He told a story about a pigeon that had gotten into the daycare yard and the chaos that followed, acting out every part with a 3-year-old's total physical commitment, and my parents laughed in the way adults laugh when they are genuinely delighted and not performing delight. Tomas ate carefully. He asked for the bread. He said thank you each time anything was passed to him. My mother told him he had good manners and he said, "Tia Marisol taught me," and she smiled at me briefly and then turned back to Nando, who had moved on to a second story involving a fire truck and a misunderstanding. After dinner my father moved to his chair in the living room and I helped my mother clear the table. The boys were in the back room where my mother had set up a small bin of old toys she'd retrieved from the garage, Priya's and mine from childhood, still there, still sorted by color. My mother said while she was rinsing a dish, "Nando is going to be fine. He has that quality, you know? He draws people in." I said, "They're both adjusting well." She set the dish in the rack. "Tomas is very closed off." I set the serving bowl on the counter. "He's 6. He lost his home and his mother in the same month." She nodded in a way that did not indicate agreement so much as patience. "I just think you should be realistic," she said. "Some children come to it easier than others." I folded the dish towel in half and set it on the counter and said nothing. My father called from the living room. "He's got too much of that side in him. You can see it already." A pause. "Focus on the little one. That one will give you something back." I stood in the kitchen doorway. The back room was 12 feet from where I was standing. Tomas was sitting on the floor sorting through the old toys. I did not know in that moment whether he had heard. I looked at the way he was sitting, very still, not looking toward the doorway, hands moving deliberately through the bin, and I understood that he had. I walked back to the kitchen. I picked the dish towel back up. My hands needed something to hold. "He's my nephew," I said. "He's 6 years old." My father did not respond. The television continued. My mother began wiping down the counter. I went back to the boys. Act 3. That was the first time I heard it said plainly. It was not the first time I had felt it. Looking back now, I can trace the pattern to before the boys ever arrived, to the way my parents had always held certain things. My father's approval, the shape of what a good outcome looked like, the question of who in the family was worth the investment, and the way those things had been quietly organized around some people and away from others for as long as I could remember. I was the first one. Not the first child, that was me, but the first one who did not quite fit the version of the story my father was telling about the family. He had started his business, a commercial landscaping company, when I was 4. By the time I was in high school, it employed 23 people and held maintenance contracts with 3 municipal parks in Fresno County. He was proud of it the way men are proud of things they have made with their hands and their judgment, and that pride was real and I respected it. What I could not quite locate for most of my childhood was where I fit inside it. Priya fit. Priya was easy in that house in a way that I understood was not a failing on my part and not a performance on hers. She was simply made of the same material as the room, and I was made of something slightly different. She could walk into my father's office at the landscaping yard and ask him a question about invoicing, and he would turn from whatever he was doing and explain it to her with patience and pleasure. I had tried at 13 to learn the dispatch software he was using so I could help on summer mornings. He had watched me for 10 minutes and then said, not unkindly, "This isn't really your thing," and gone back to work. I had spent the next 15 years proving in increments that something was my thing. Not to him. To myself mostly, and then to the patients who came to me unable to hold a pen, unable to button a shirt, and left being able to do both. I had built a caseload. I had built a reputation at the clinic. I had taken on a supervisory role the year before Tomas and Nando arrived, overseeing 2 newer therapists and developing a sensory integration protocol that the clinic had adopted across all of its pediatric cases. I had done this quietly, the way I did most things, without announcement. None of this had reorganized my father's understanding of what I was capable of. I am not sure he knew the word caseload as it applied to my work. I am not sure my mother could have named the difference between occupational therapy and physical therapy when the boys first moved in. They knew I was good with children. That was the version of my competence that made sense to them. In the first year that Tomas and Nando lived with me, I did the following. I attended 41 school events, conferences, or teacher meetings, 23 for Tomas, 18 for Nando. I drove a combined 800 and some miles to those meetings across one calendar year, in evening hours, rearranging my clinical schedule each time. I established a homework routine for Tomas that his second-grade teacher told me, at his spring conference, had resulted in the most measurable reading level progress she had seen in a student that year. I found a pediatric therapist who worked on a sliding scale and began taking Tomas to appointments every other week starting in February, because I had noticed the stillness in him calcifying in a way that worried me, and I had learned enough about children in my professional life to know that worried feeling was not to be ignored. I learned to make the specific noodle dish Nando called the flat ones. He meant wide egg noodles with butter and a particular ratio of salt, because it was the only food he asked for by name in the first month, and I made it correctly on the 4th try, and his face when he tasted it was something I still think about. I coordinated with Priya's case manager 6 times, navigating the bureaucratic seams between her program and the family court paperwork that had begun, quietly, in the background. I did this after the boys were asleep. My parents came to the apartment twice in the first year. They stayed for dinner both times. Both times my mother brought food, tamales the first visit, a pot of beans the second, and both times my father sat in my one good chair and watched television with the boys while my mother and I cooked in the kitchen. The second visit, Tomas showed my father a drawing he had made in school, a detailed, careful map of the neighborhood around my apartment, with the park labeled and the school labeled and a small figure he had drawn standing outside the clinic building because he knew that was where I worked. It was the best thing he had made that month. He had shown it to me twice before he showed it to my father. My father looked at it. He said, "It's a little messy." He handed it back. Tomas set the drawing on the side table next to my father's chair and did not pick it up again for the rest of the visit. I found it there when I was cleaning up after my parents left. I put it on the refrigerator. My mother, that same evening, held Nando in her lap for 40 minutes while he told her an elaborate story about a dog that had walked past our building. She laughed and asked questions and stroked his hair. It was genuine. I want to be clear about that. It was entirely genuine, and it was also, in its total focus, a door closing on the other side of the room where Tomas had folded himself into the corner of the couch with a book. I noticed. I noticed every time. The second year, Tomas had a difficult fall. He began hitting a wall at school, not behavior, not defiance, but something quieter, a slow withdrawal from classroom participation, a regression in the reading progress that had been so pronounced the year before. His teacher flagged it in October. I already knew. I had been watching it build since August, when the anniversary of Priya going to Bakersfield had passed and Tomas had stopped talking about her the way he had before, with the ordinary casualness of a child who expects someone to return, and started talking about her less, and then not at all. I increased his therapy appointments. I took a week of reduced hours at the clinic, unpaid, so I could be home earlier in the afternoons. I found a social skills group at a community center 2 miles away that met on Saturday mornings, and I took him every week for 14 weeks until the thing that had calcified in him began, slowly, to loosen. By December of that year he had 2 friends at school. Real ones, the kind that called the apartment phone and asked for him specifically. He showed me his reading log for the semester and it was the best it had ever been. I did not tell my parents about the difficult fall. I did not tell them because I knew what they would say, and I was not willing to hear it said again in front of a child who was already carrying too much. Act 4. The dinner happened in early March of the 3rd year. I had been managing, by that point, a set of circumstances that had been quietly compounding for some time. Priya had completed her residential program and moved into a supported living situation in Stockton, closer than Bakersfield, which was something, but the question of the boys' longer-term arrangement had not been formally resolved. There was paperwork in process. There had been a hearing in January that I had attended alone, that my parents had not attended, and that had resulted in a continuation to April. A family law attorney I had found through a colleague had been helping me understand what my options were, what the boys' options were, and what the process of establishing formal guardianship would require. It was not an emergency. It was not nothing either. My father had called me the week before the dinner and asked, in a tone that signaled this was not a casual question, whether I had thought through the long-term situation. I told him I had an attorney and the process was in motion. He said, "I just don't want you to be in a position where you've sacrificed everything for something that doesn't work out." I said the boys were doing well. He said, "I'm talking about you." I squared the phone against my ear and said I appreciated his concern. The dinner was at my parents' house. My mother had made a full Sunday meal, rice, beans, chicken in a sauce she made from a recipe her own mother had given her, the kind of meal that took 3 hours and was, I think, her way of being present in the situation without knowing what else to do. The table was set properly. Nando was wearing a shirt with buttons because I had told him it was a special dinner and he had taken that seriously. Tomas had brought his library book and I had gently asked him to leave it in the car, and he had, without complaint. Nando, who was now 6, performed. He always performed at that table. It was not calculation, it was just who he was, a child who moved through rooms like a small warm current, and my parents received him the way they always did, with complete and undivided delight. My father let him sit in his lap for part of the meal. My mother refilled his plate without being asked. Tomas, who was 9, sat beside me. He ate well. He answered questions when asked. My mother asked about school. He told her about a science project on water cycles that his class was presenting in 2 weeks. She said, "That sounds interesting," in the tone of someone who has asked a question and received an answer and is now ready to move on. He nodded and went back to his food. My father had been quiet through most of the meal, which was not unusual. He spoke when the conversation interested him and otherwise occupied a particular quality of silence that everyone at that table had learned, over years, to read. Nando had just finished telling an elaborate story about his best friend at school, a boy named Marcus who had apparently orchestrated a mud-related incident at recess that the entire class had found funny except the teacher, and my parents were still laughing when my mother turned to me and said, in a lowered voice, as though the table were larger than it was, "He's really something, Nando. You can see it." I said, "They're both doing really well." My father reached for his water glass. "Pour your energy into the sweet one," he said. He did not lower his voice. "The other one isn't worth it." I set my fork down. Tomas was 9 years old. He was sitting 12 inches to my left. The table was not large. My father had not looked at him when he said it, which was, I think, the part that was worst, not that he had said it in front of him, but that he had said it without looking, the way you speak about furniture, about something that does not have ears. Nando had gone quiet. He was looking at his plate. Tomas was very still. I picked my glass up and set it down. I looked at my father. He was looking at his plate, adding salt to something entirely ordinary. I said quietly, "I'd like to take the boys to wash their hands before dessert." My mother looked at me. Something moved across her face that was not quite guilt and was not quite nothing. She said, "Of course." I put my hand on Tomas's shoulder and stood up. Nando slid off my father's lap and came to my other side. We walked down the hallway to the bathroom, the 3 of us, and I ran the water warm and I handed each of them a towel, and I did not look at my own face in the mirror because I did not want to see it. Tomas dried his hands slowly. He was looking at the towel. He said, without looking up, He was talking about me. I said, yes. He nodded once, the way someone nods when they have understood something they already knew and were hoping they were wrong about. I turned the water off. I folded my towel over the bar. I said, what he said is not true. Do you understand that it is not true? He looked at me then. His face was 9 years old and very controlled, the face of a child who had learned early to receive hard information without letting it move through him all at once. He said, okay. I said, we're going to go have dessert. And then I'm going to handle this. He looked at me for another moment. Then he nodded again, smaller this time, more specific, and we went back down the hall. Dessert was flan. My mother had made it the day before, unmolded onto a plate with the caramel running down the sides, and it sat in the center of the table the way good food does, as a kind of peace offering that doesn't name itself as one. Nando ate his in 4 bites and asked if he could have more. My father gave him the last of his own portion and Nando accepted this as entirely natural. Tomas ate slowly. I watched him from the corner of my eye. His face was composed. Whatever had moved through him in that bathroom had been put somewhere, not away I knew, but somewhere he could manage it. I ate my flan. I set my spoon down. I said, before we leave I'd like to talk about something. My mother looked at me. My father looked at the table. I said, about the guardianship hearing in April. My father said, I thought you had an attorney handling it. I do, I said. But there's information the family needs to have. Given what you both just said at dinner. My mother said, Marisol, in the tone she used when she was trying to fold something back before it fully opened. I'd like to finish, I said. I reached into my bag which I had brought back to the table after dessert was served. I produced a folder, a standard manila folder, the kind I used for clinical documentation, and I placed it on the table in front of me. I opened it. I took the first document out and set it down. This is the guardianship filing, I said. The court date is April 14th. My attorney will be present. I want you to understand what's being formalized. My father looked at the document without touching it. We know what guardianship is. I know you do, I said. But I want to be specific. Because you said tonight that Tomas isn't worth the investment. And I think you should know what has actually been invested. In Tomas specifically. My father's jaw shifted. He said, that isn't what I meant. I set the second document on top of the first. It was a letter from Tomas's school from his teacher addressed to me, describing his academic progress over the prior 18 months. Reading level advancement of 2 full grade bands. Consistent improvement in classroom participation. A specific note about a science presentation, the water cycle project he had mentioned at dinner, that she was calling the best in the class. His teacher wrote this in January, I said. My mother picked it up. She read it. She set it down. I set the third document on the table. This one was a letter from the pediatric therapist, not clinical notes, nothing protected, but a summary letter she had written at my request when the guardianship process began, describing the progress she had observed in Tomas over 14 months of biweekly sessions. She had used the phrase remarkable capacity for trust building in a secure attachment context. I had read that phrase 6 times when the letter arrived. My father said, You went to all this trouble? I went to all this trouble, I said, because he is 9 years old and he heard what you said. The table was quiet. Nando had stopped moving. He was looking at Nando in the way children look when they understand that something important is happening and have decided to be very small and very still. My father said, Children are resilient. I looked at him. You said tonight at this table that he wasn't worth it. He was sitting right there. I kept my voice level. I want to make sure we don't move past that. My father looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, I was talking about the difficulty of the situation. You were talking about him, I said. He understood that. I am not going to pretend otherwise. My mother said quietly, Roberto. My father set his water glass down. I said, You told me when I was 13 that dispatching wasn't really my thing. I spent 6 months trying to learn it so I could help you. You told me when I took the boys in that I should be realistic about what I was taking on. You have sat in my apartment twice in 3 years and the only thing you said directly to Tomas in either visit was that his drawing was messy. My father said, I don't see what that has to do with. I'm not finished, I said. He stopped. You said tonight that I should pour my energy into the sweet one. I set the next document on the table, a single page printed from my own records. A log. Dates, events, mileage. 41 school meetings. The therapy appointments. The social skills group 14 weeks. Specific. Numbered. This is what I was actually doing while you were deciding he wasn't worth it. My father looked at the page. He did not pick it up. My mother had both hands flat on the table. She was looking at a point somewhere between the documents and the flan plate. I said, I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm telling you what is happening. The hearing is April 14th. The boys will be staying with me. And I am asking you directly to decide what role you want to play in their lives, both of them, because I will not bring Tomas back to a table where he is told he isn't worth the effort. Not at 6, not at 9, not at any age. I closed the folder. I picked up my fork and finished the last bite of my flan. Act 6. We left 40 minutes later. My mother walked us to the car. She hugged Nando for a long time and then she looked at Tomas and said, I want to see your science presentation. Tomas looked at her. He said, it's on a Thursday. She said, tell your aunt to send me the date. He nodded. It was not forgiveness. It was something smaller and more specific, a door left slightly open, which was more than it had been 2 hours earlier. My father did not come to the door. On the drive home, Nando fell asleep in the back seat before we reached the highway. Tomas sat beside him, awake, looking at the window. The valley at night is flat and dark and the lights of other cars come at you in long, slow intervals. He said after a while, what were those papers? Records, I said. Of things we've done together. He was quiet for a moment. Did you always have them? I started keeping them when the court process began, I said. But the things in them go back to the beginning. He thought about this. Then he said, the drawing. Did you keep that? I said, it's on the refrigerator. He turned back to the window. Outside, the valley continued, flat and dark and going on. 3 weeks later, I met with my attorney to finalize the April submission. She reviewed the folder I had brought to dinner, the school letter, the therapist's summary, the log, and added them to the evidentiary record. She said the file was strong. I told her that was good to know. I did not tell her about the dinner. It was not relevant to the legal question. It was relevant to the other question, the one that had been sitting underneath everything for 3 years, longer than that, since I was 13 and standing in a dispatch office being told something wasn't really my thing. What I had put on that table was not an argument. It was a record. A plain, documented account of what had been done by whom, for whom, across how many miles and how many hours and how many mornings when I had gotten up early so that 2 small people could get to school on time. I had not put it there to win anything. I had put it there because Tomas had sat at that table and heard himself described as an investment that wouldn't pay off, and I was not willing to let that stand as the last word spoken in that house about who he was. There is a kind of dismissal that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice. It reaches for the salt and speaks about furniture and turns back to the television, and if you don't have a record, if you don't have 41 dates written down in a notebook, if you don't have a letter from a teacher that says remarkable, it can sit in a room for years and never get answered. I had the record. My father called me the following Sunday. He did not apologize, that is not a word that has ever moved easily in his direction, but he said that he had been thinking about what I'd said. He said he had looked up what an occupational therapist actually does. He said, and I could hear that it cost him something to say it, you're good at it from what I can tell. I said, I know. He said he thought he might come to the science presentation. I told him it was on a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon and he would need to leave work early. He said he would see what he could do. He came. He sat in a gymnasium chair and watched his 9-year-old grandson stand in front of a poster about the water cycle and explain, with complete seriousness and one small joke about clouds that made the room laugh, how evaporation worked. My father clapped. He clapped the way people clap when they are surprised by something and trying not to show it. After, in the parking lot, Tomas showed him the certificate his teacher had given every presenter. My father looked at it for a long time. He said, that's good work. Tomas said, thank you. It was not everything. I want to be clear about that. It was not a transformation, not a resolution, not the scene at the end of a story where everything becomes what it should have been all along. It was a Thursday afternoon in a school parking lot in Sacramento. It was a man looking at a piece of paper that said his grandson had done good work and saying so. Some things you cannot fix. Some things you can only document and name and refuse to let pass without being named. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the act of naming is enough to move something that has been fixed in place for a very long time, even just a few degrees, even just enough to let a little light through. Act 7. Tomas is 11 now. He reads above grade level. He has a best friend named Marcus, the same Marcus of the mud incident it turned out, and on Saturday mornings they ride their bikes to the park 4 blocks from the apartment and I watch them from the kitchen window while I make coffee, and they look like children who belong to themselves, which is the thing I most wanted for him. Nando is 8. He is still the person who walks into rooms like a small warm current, and I think he always will be. He has started asking questions about his mother, thoughtful, specific questions, the kind that tell you a child is building something rather than just missing someone, and Priya is present enough now to answer them mostly. She calls twice a week. She is trying. I believe she is trying. The guardianship is formal now. The April hearing went the way my attorney said it would. The boys are mine in the way that the law means and also in the way that the law doesn't quite cover. I think about that dinner sometimes. I think about the way my father reached for the salt. I think about Tomas sitting 12 inches from me, very still, his hands in his lap, taking in something he already knew and had hoped he was wrong about. I think about what it costs a child to hear themselves described as a diminishing return by someone who is supposed to be the floor beneath their feet. And I think about what it means to make a record. Not because records fix things, they don't, not entirely, not always, but because a record refuses the version of events where nothing happened, where it was said without consequence, where a child sat at a table and heard himself described as not worth it and no one answered. I answered. You do not have to wait until everything is already lost to name what is happening. You do not have to have the perfect argument or the irrefutable evidence before you set down your fork and say, this is not true and I will not let it stand. The record doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to go to court. It just has to exist, somewhere written down in a notebook in your kitchen drawer, in a folder in a bag you bring to dinner, so that when the moment comes you have something to put on the table. I had a folder and I put it on the table and I said, here is what was actually happening while you were deciding it wasn't worth watching. That is all I did. It was enough. If this story found you, share it with someone who's been told their investment wouldn't pay off. They might need to hear that the record matters. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, names, events, and situations depicted are entirely fictional and any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.